It's time for another episode of the 6Ps podcast, and once again we're delving into Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. Today's episode is going to focus on the key theme of apartheid. Just to give you some basic information, apartheid was a system of institutionalised racial segregation and discrimination enforced by the South African government from 1948 until 1994. That was designed to maintain white minority rule by oppressing the non-white populations. And in the text, these are referred to as black South Africans, as coloured South Africans, and Indians. Note the phrase the white minority rule. That's something to think about when phrasing what we would generally call minority groups. We'll probably use a phrase like marginalised groups instead. Now, it restricted the rights, the movements and the opportunities of black South Africans and other racial groups, leading to decades of resistance as well as international condemnation before its eventual abolition in 1994. And the abolition of apartheid is compared to the Berlin Wall falling, albeit very, very differently. With the international condemnation as well, from an Australian point of view, you might be aware that many Australian teams boycotted, so the rugby teams and cricket teams boycotted playing South Africa, and the IOC as well, the Olympic Games, they weren't able to compete. Now, something to note that while the text is initially set during apartheid, so Trevor Noah was born in the 80s during apartheid regime, most of the text takes place post-apartheid. However, while the legal aspects of apartheid have been dismantled, the thinking, the values and the remnants still linger. And there's a quote there on the right hand side. The genius of apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other. Apart-hate is what it was. You separate people into groups and make them hate one another so you can run them all. I always think it's useful to build a vocab list for the key themes and ideas. Just one as a way to maybe get some more ideas out, but also to ensure that you can express yourself in a varied way without repeating certain words and phrases. So if you're not too sure about what all of these mean, then I definitely encourage you to research them and then use them in your writing. I think one of the main things I take from apartheid is this phrase here. Every character's position in society, their motivations, their actions, their experiences, and the consequences of all these things are shaped in some way by apartheid. And that's a nice segue to then talk about how apartheid links or impacts on the characters within the text. So I guess we'll start with our protagonist and our narrator, Trevor. He was obviously born to a black mother and a white father, and his very existence was illegal under apartheid's racial laws. He was born a crime. And it's no mistake that the text opens with that historical document of the Immorality Act from 1927. He struggles with his identity, facing exclusion from, all communities really that he's faced with, forcing him to become, a cultural chameleon. When it comes to Patricia, she defies apartheid's restrictions by learning English and securing a job and raising Trevor independently. She faces systemic oppression as a Xhosa woman, but resists through resilience and also her faith and religion. Robert is a Swiss-German man who defies apartheid by having a relationship with Patricia, but he must keep his distance from Trevor to avoid legal repercussions. We also know that he's someone who defies apartheid laws as well in terms of running his restaurants and who he associates with as well, and that all comes up in chapter 8. Now Abel, he benefits from, the patriarchal norms that are reinforced by apartheid, but becomes an embodiment of the cycle of violence created by oppression and poverty. Trevor's family, his grandmother particularly, who was raised under apartheid's rigid racial hierarchy, well, she internalises its restrictions and often treats Trevor differently because of his lighter skin. In fact, a lot of the family members do. They also view his prayers as being more important as well because he speaks English. The Hulk, who comes up in part 3 in jail, He represents black men who, despite the end of apartheid, remained trapped in the cycle of poverty and crime due to the long-lasting effects of systemic discrimination, and we'll touch on him a little bit later on. And the last one, a character that I seem to continually talk about and write about in my essays, is Teddy, who represents corruption of the justice system and is punished based on his ethnicity. And obviously there's a comparison between the way he is treated and punished and that of Trevor. When it comes to the settings, the two places you should definitely know are Soweto and Alex or Alexandra. The two quotes there. Soweto was designed to be bombed, and the township was in a constant state of insurrection or uprising. Someone was always marching or protesting somewhere and had to be suppressed. I think it's important to note that Soweto, and that last quote works really well for that. Soweto was the home of the Soweto Uprising in 1976, which was a student-led protest against the mandatory use of Afrikaans in black schools, which was seen as a language of the oppressor. And around 20,000 students participated in that, facing extreme police violence, and it resulted in a lot of deaths, actually, and that was in 1976, so 18 years before apartheid ended. The other quote, obviously, in terms of, that Soweto was designed to be bombed, the quote continues to say, if the monkeys ever went crazy and tried to break out of their cage, the Air Force could fly over and bomb the shit out of everyone. So we've got obviously the animal imagery of monkeys and the dehumanization which they faced. And obviously this idea and the explicit language to show how they were viewed, particularly by government institutions. When it comes to Alex, the other quote, and sorry I couldn't fit all of them in here, but there's some personification as well in one of the prefaces when Trevor Noah talks about Alex. He said, Alex fought and held on and asserted its right to exist. Wealthy white suburbs like Santon grew around it, but Alex remained. And it's a nice bit of personification because it really does highlight the defiance and the resilience of the people who lived in Alex. Looking at some of the ideas based around apartheid that are expressed in the text, and obviously one of the key ideas is how absurd apartheid was, how illogical, how irrational the thinking behind it was. It also explores the racial classification and identity around that. It explores defiance, survival and resilience. It explores the systemic nature of oppression, as well as humour and the way that humour is used to survive apartheid. And that last idea about education perpetuating inequality, but also this idea that education can help overcome apartheid and provide a pathway to success for some individuals. The values that are explored in the text, so there's just a couple here. There's dignity, resilience, family and relationships, justice, freedom and community. And some of the concerns in the text are the lasting impact of apartheid on social division, especially after apartheid when the majority of this text takes place. We've got the psychological trauma caused by systemic racism. We've got the continued inequality and segregation post-apartheid, the poverty and economic disparity between cultural groups, and the failure of the justice system. And these are all things we should be looking to write about in our essays. But we might start looking at a couple of these ideas in more detail now. The first one is absurdity, and Noah exposes the irrationality and cruelty of apartheid laws, showing how they divided communities, restricted freedoms, and enforced racial injustice through systemic oppression. And the example I think about here is Teddy's arrest and his punishment, followed by Trevor's questioning and I guess how Trevor gets away with it. And the quote that springs to mind, and again, it's a quote I use a lot in my writing, is when he's sort of discussing the police and I guess the justice system in general. He says, these people had been so effed by their own construct of race, they could not see that the white person they were looking for, that's in the CCTV footage, was sitting right in front of them. And that whole sort of scene on page 158 and 159 is full of quotes that you can use to talk about how absurd this construct of race was, how they pigeonholed people based on race, and there were so many flaws involved in that. And we'll get onto another example later on as well. but Teddy's a particularly important example of that. Some other quotations you might want to look at, well, that phrase that apartheid was the perfect racism, it's a bit of an oxymoron, and that apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. This is the preface that comes up before Chapter 6, Loopholes. I won't read it all out to you now, but it sort of compares the way Chinese people and Japanese people were labelled, and the fact that they were labelled differently or classified differently purely based on, I guess, corruption. That the government, it's that quote there, the government wanted to establish good relations with the Japanese in order to import their fancy cars and electronics. And you've got that little sort of informal phrasing below there, you know, hey, get off that bench, you Chinaman. Excuse me, I'm Japanese. Oh, I apologise, sir. I didn't mean to be racist. Have a lovely afternoon. It's that satire that Trevor Noah uses once again to highlight, to pinpoint, to emphasise the absurdity, the illogical nature of apartheid and particularly racial classification. When it comes to identity and belonging, I guess part of the text is all about, and particularly in terms of the format, you've got the prefaces followed by the chapters. It's the prefaces really tend to focus on the macro, what's happening across all of South Africa, as well as across the world in some of them. And then the chapters then delve into the micro, the what's happening in South Africa, particularly in Trevor's life. And Noah delves into how apartheid's oppressive laws profoundly affected individuals, shaping their identities, their relationships, and their daily lives. Through his experiences and those of his family and friends, he reveals how people were forced to navigate a system that stripped them of their humanity and reduced their worth to mere racial classifications. And we've already had an example of that through that animal imagery that came up before. The example I look at here is the relationship he holds with his family, and that quote, my grandmother treated me like I was white, my grandfather did too, only he was even more extreme. And there's many examples where Trevor, within his family, is, I guess, punished differently to other members of his family and his cousins. Some other quotations here. It is easier to be an insider as an outsider than to be an outsider as an insider, on page 118 and later on in that chapter. One of the most sinister things about apartheid was that it taught coloured people that it was black people who were holding them back. And this idea that apartheid did really cause divisions within these marginalised groups. And we know that when apartheid ended, that's when sort of black South Africa went to war with each other. That comes up in the first preface as well. And this idea that apartheid really does impact on an individual's life, particularly Trevor's. He has to learn to become, I guess, a bit of a chameleon. But throughout his childhood, he does continuously label himself as an anomaly, as an outsider, and he talks about feeling quite isolated at times and even having to sort of hide behind walls, not being able to be with his mother and father in public as well. So many instances that you can take how apartheid impacted on his family unit, this personal space. It's also a bit of a social commentary as well, where Noah is deeply critical of apartheid's lasting impact on South Africa, and he highlights how its structures of inequality and injustice continued to shape society long after its official end in 1994, leaving many still trapped in cycles of poverty and discrimination. And as I mentioned before, the Hulk is a good example of this, a man who he meets in jail who is stereotyped based on the way he looks. And again, there's a long passage here on pages 237 and 238, but this part of the quote I think would definitely be worth using. He talks about his story when he gets to know him and he's able to, through his language skills. He said, it was a South African story that was all too familiar for me. Apartheid ends and it doesn't even have that, and he doesn't even have that anymore. He's lost. He has no education. He has no skills. The law isn't rational at all, and it's a lottery. That metaphor of life for him being a lottery, it's all about luck. And the word no is used a lot. It's repeated in that. The word no is repeated a lot in that passage to really highlight, I guess, what they don't have, what is not provided to them, what limitations they actually have. And the fact that he says that this was an all too familiar story suggests that this is widespread, But the Hulk is that one example of what's happening across South Africa. It's the micro and the macro. Some other quotations, we've already seen this one before, but the genius of apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other. And when apartheid came, coloured people defied easy categorisation, so the system used them quite brilliantly to sow confusion, hatred, and mistrust. The last idea I want to focus on today is defiance and how apartheid is overcome. And despite the harsh realities of apartheid, Noah highlights and even champions how he and others found ways to resist and persevere. And Patricia, his mother's determination and defiance, serve as a powerful example of resilience against an unjust system. The key example, I think, is just Patricia's decision to have Trevor. And on page 22, he says she had a level of fearlessness. If you stop to consider the ramifications, you'll never do anything. She was hell-bent on raising a child, and even the fact she didn't even want Robert to be involved in it shows her defiance. Of course, there are plenty of examples throughout the text. A lot of different ways that individuals do defy apartheid, and whether it's learning a language, whether it's Patricia getting a job, whether it's her having Trevor, whether it's through humour and mocking the system as well. There's so many different ways that individuals defy apartheid and thrive from it. Some other quotations you might find useful. Again, a quote about his mum: whenever the riots broke out, all our neighbours would wisely hole up behind closed doors, but not my mum. And when it's talking about her and her desire to get to church, there are a lot of quotes in that passage that you might find really useful. And this quote on page 21. Race mixing doesn't merely challenge the system as unjust, it reveals the system as unsustainable and incoherent. As we know, it's important that we're just not using quotations when it comes to analysing the text. We also need to think about textual features, so literary features, structural features and stylistic features, to showcase to the examiner that we aren't just analysing what is in the text, but how the text is written as well. And a structural feature to start with is the beginning, the opening, or before the text even starts. We have this Immorality Act of 1927, which highlights the absurdity and cruelty of apartheid's racial laws, particularly how they criminalised human relationships. You know, that idea that this is a really intimate thing to do, is to have a child, and they try and criminalise it. It also provides a bit of authenticity to apartheid thinking and perspectives. And given the text is fictional in areas, and particularly when he recalls some of the events that happened in his childhood, it does, I guess, ground it in reality for us, particularly at the start. This phrase, apartheid was perfect racism, is ironic, as racism is inherently flawed and destructive. And the word perfect suggests a sinister efficiency in how apartheid institutionalised racial oppression. So we've got a bit of a paradox here in that phrasing of perfect racism. There's also some symbolism. Nelson Mandela's name comes up a little bit. I think, and we might get onto a little bit later on, this idea that Mandela, and please go out and research him if you don't know who he is. He was obviously imprisoned. He was released from jail. He ended up becoming president of South Africa, but there's this idea that Mandela came to power and everything sort of changed. But I think he sort of challenges that. That idea that then apartheid fell, Mandela walked free, and Black South Africa went to war with itself. And while Mandela is often a symbol of hope and freedom and liberty, within the text, his rise to power does not correlate with better conditions. Some other text features, again, a structural feature, are the prefaces. I mentioned this before, but obviously they're used to provide contextual information on, and this is generally speaking. Some of them are a little bit more personal, but they do provide that historical grounding on apartheid thinking and values, and then showcases how these translate into his personal life. We've got some word choice here with the word sinister in this quote from page 120, which conveys a deep-rooted malice, showing apartheid's psychological manipulation. And the phrase taught coloured people implies indoctrination and I guess suggests that division was deliberately instilled. And this quote here, and again we're talking about word choice, that's how a police state works. Everyone thinks everyone else is the police. And that phrasing of everyone thinks everyone else is the police highlights the paranoia and the surveillance I guess, the culture of surveillance and spying under apartheid. And the repetition of everyone, I guess, emphasises how distrust permeated society in South Africa at the time. In terms of authorial intent, we've got a few quotes here. You might have seen them in the previous video, but Noah critiques the absurdity and the hypocrisy of apartheid, exposing its arbitrary and oppressive nature. He condemns the systemic racism and segregation that shaped South African society, highlighting its lasting effects on society and individuals even after the end of the regime. He exposes the complexities of identity and belonging, showing how race, language and class can influence someone's upbringing. He exposes the economic struggles of marginalised communities, emphasising the cycle of poverty in South Africa. He challenges misconceptions about the country, providing a personal perspective on South African life, which is where that idea about Nelson Mandela come up, but something that's a little bit more positive. He champions defiance against injustice and against apartheid, illustrating how small acts of rebellion can challenge oppressive systems, and then celebrating that resilience and determination of those who resist oppression. I've got a bit of a sample paragraph here that's sort of that mid to high range. Racial tensions are depicted as being highly prevalent within Borna crime, forcing Noah to adapt in a society that continued to grapple with racism even after the fall of apartheid. The chapter Chameleon underscores Noah's reckoning with his place in the world, where his ability to assimilate with different cultures became a survival tool. The symbol of a chameleon reflects his ability to change depending on context, something he deemed necessary to break free from the cycle of oppression inflicted upon Black South Africans through systemic racism. These racial tensions are further critiqued by Noah, not only for their presence on the streets, where people were taught to believe that it was black people holding them back, but also within his family setting. He humorously recalls being treated differently because he was the only white-looking child in the family, and possibly because he was a little shit. By juxtaposing the seriousness of being somewhat ostracised by his family due to the colour of his skin with light-hearted humour, Noah uses comedy as a survival mechanism to cope with the painful reality of racial tension, while also exposing the deeply ingrained racism within South African society. And look, I think it's a really nice piece of writing. There's some really good vocab and fluency there. I would have liked maybe a more specific example at the start, but there's some nice context detail here. They've also included some literary features as well, so they've done a pretty good job with that paragraph. Some final tips. Build your historical knowledge of apartheid. Again, throughout the text, there are many references to historical events as well, so you might find that really useful, particularly in the prefaces. I want you to consider employing some of the vocabulary into your writing as well, and try and vary that vocab when it comes to apartheid, and especially when it comes to authorial intent. Obviously, Trevor Noah is condemning apartheid thinking and perspectives and what happened during the time, but try and think of different ways, I guess, to say that. Think about building a quotation and an evidence bank as well, and think about how apartheid relates to the other themes and the ideas in the text.